In this video, we're going to talk about how to estimate your state's 529 college savings plan costs and compare those costs to another state's 529 plan so you can make the right decision on which 529 plan to choose. And this is really important, especially if your state has an income tax deduction for 529 plans. But before we do this, if this is your first time at our channel or you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button at the bottom. My name is Travis Sickle, certified financial planner, helping you reach your financial goals. So there are a whole bunch of different costs inside of a 529 plan, whether they're called fees or expenses, they're all costs, and not all of them are the same. Some are on an annual basis, like the expense ratios, which is the annual charge on the assets or the dollars that you have in the plan. Or there are admin fees, setup fees, transaction fees. So those are like the one-time fees that we're going to take a look at. So there's the one-time fees, the annual fees, and then there is the benefit. And the benefit is really the tax deduction. Now, if your state doesn't have an income tax deduction for 529 plans, that part's going to be irrelevant, but this video certainly will help you still compare the cost and make that decision. But if your state does have an income tax deduction on 529 plans, this is also one other piece that you have to consider when you're comparing 529 college savings plans. Now, the first calculation that I want to go through is really just so you can understand what an expense ratio is, or the annual fees are, and the tax deduction on the other side. So the tax deduction is a benefit because you're getting that money back in a refund, again, if your state has an income tax deduction on 529 plans. So let's jump in and compare an in-state plan with a tax deduction versus one without its tax deduction. And there are a ton of different variations in these 529 plans. So again, if your particular state has an income tax deduction or doesn't, some states even have income tax deductions if you go to another state. So there's a ton of different variables in here, but I'm going to do the best that I can so you can understand what these costs look like. So let's start with an in-state plan. So I'm going to label this in state on this side and then out of state on this side. Now, in this example, we're going to assume that we're going to contribute $10,000 to each plan, $10,000 and $10,000. And then we're going to multiply that by the annual fee. Now, the annual fee for both of these is going to be 0.17%. So it's also said as 17 basis points. And if you're unfamiliar with what a basis point is, there's 100 basis points in 1%. So you can imagine how small of a fee 0.17 of 1% really is, or what we call it as 17 basis points. So on $10,000 at 17 basis points, that's going to be $17. So the expense ratio is the fee that's charged on an annual basis on your plan. Now, we're going to assume in this example that we have 10 years until your child is going to go to college. So we're going to use 10 years. So let's multiply that annual fee by 10 years. So that's 17 times 10, which is going to be $170. Now we're going to compare the plans and assume that they have the same expense ratio. So that's why they both have $170. Now let's look at an income tax deduction. Now, income tax deductions are going to be dependent on if you have one, how much you can deduct, and what your income tax rate is on your state. So for this walkthrough, we're going to assume that we have a 6% state tax and up to a $10,000 income tax deduction. So what this means is if you earn $100,000 and your state has this 529 plan income tax deduction and you put $10,000 into the plan, that means only $90,000 is as taxable income. Now, if your tax rate is at 6%, so that means we can do 6% times $10,000, which is $600. This is the amount that we would save if we put the $10,000 into this 529 plan. So the $170 is the fee, but we're getting back $600 in a tax refund or lower taxable income. So if we net those out, that means using this 529 plan is making us $430 richer. Now, if we stopped right there, we'd have a good understanding of how tax deductions work for the 529 plan and how those fees work or the expense ratios work inside of the 529 plan. But we wouldn't have a good idea if we wanted to contribute on a monthly basis, or if the fees were different, or if there was other variables that would affect which plan you should choose. And if we stopped right here, you're probably thinking, well, if my state has an income tax deduction, that's the plan I should go with, right? Not always. So let's go into a calculator that's going to give us a lot more information to help us make a better decision. So here we have a calculator that's comparing two 529 plans. We have 529 plan 1 and 529 plan number 2. So right now I have it set up so everything is exactly the same. We have 0.17% as the expense ratio, or 17 basis points. We have the state income tax at 5%, max tax deduction at $10,000. So the states that have these tax deductions, a lot of times they're at $10,000 if it's merely filing jointly, or if it's single, it's $5,000. But depending on your particular state, those facts are going to change. So we're just going to go through a couple of examples so you can start to understand that these things really depend on what you're going to do with these plans, and not just whether or not it's a high cost or if it has a state tax deduction. So the first thing that we can do is we can increase the fee of one of these plans, and let's make it 55 basis points. And I have it set up so it'll highlight the plan that is the most beneficial in terms of cost. So you can see right away that if everything is the same, you want to pick the cheaper plan. Of course, that makes sense. If they're exactly the same plans and one's cheaper than the other, that would make sense to go with the cheaper plan. But as we showed previously, if we have an income tax deduction on our state taxes, then that plan would make the most sense, or could make the most sense. But in this example, if we take away that state income tax deduction and zero these out, then it flips back over to what would be the more expensive plan up front, but that income tax deduction would make it so that's the plan that you should choose. But what's interesting is if we increase the amount of years that we're going to have the money in the plan, let's say we have it in for 18 years, it goes back to the other plan, because over time, the low cost plan would make more sense in this scenario. And you can see I broke down the results over here. So we see the fees of this plan are $2,167, where this plan is only $697. So this is significantly cheaper, even with the $500 tax savings that we're getting from the tax deduction. So all I'm doing here is taking this as a fee and this as a benefit or income coming back to you and netting them out. So we're left with a true cost of $1,667 versus the true cost of $697. So you can see that it's not just about the fees. You also have to look at the timing of it. So if you're going to have this plan for a long time, the cheaper plan on an annual basis could beat out the more expensive plan, even with that state income tax deduction. And the reason that is because the income state tax deduction happens up front. So as soon as you contribute those dollars into the plan, the amount that you contribute, that is what the calculation of the tax deduction is going to be based on. But over time, the charge or the fee on that growth, that is not deductible. That is just tax deferred inside of the 529 plan. So that's why it flips from one plan to the other. So right now we're looking at costs, we're looking at the deduction, and now we just threw in time as a variable to figuring out which plan we need to choose. So again, I'm going to show this again on the calculator. If we have it at 18, plan 2 from a cost perspective makes sense. But if we only have this plan for 5 years, it's going to flip back to plan 1. And if we go back to the 18 years, we could see it goes back to plan 2. But there's actually a fourth variable that you really need to pay attention to, and that's the performance of your investments. Now, if the same plan was in each 529 plan, it would be irrelevant, and we would just look at the costs and the income tax deduction and then the time frame. But performance is important. So if we're looking at these plans, we see that we have 8% as a rate of return for each of these plans. But now let's show plan 1 as getting 9% instead of an 8% annual rate of return. Now, from a cost perspective, plan 2 is still the winner. So So it is the cheaper plan, but let's look at how much money is actually in this plan. So if we look to the ending balances of these plans, plan 2, which is cheaper, only had $40,738, but plan 1 had $45,479. But if we added the tax deduction of $500, we would be even further ahead at $45,979. So even though that plan was more expensive, and it was more expensive by $1,233, even paying that extra fee, it still makes sense to go with plan 1 in this example. Now, I keep saying in this example, in this scenario, in this situation, because small variation in anything and all of this stuff can completely change which plan you should choose. So focusing just on the cost, or focusing just on the tax deduction, or getting the tax deduction, or the rate of return, or if we're going to have the plan for 1 year or 10 years, all these things affect which plan you should choose. Again, it goes back to your particular situation to make this decision. But these are important. So if you're hearing that a plan, if your state has a 529 plan that has an income tax deduction because you have a state income tax, then you might think, hey, that's the plan I should choose, right? Because I'm getting this tax deduction. It's a great benefit. Everyone's talking about it. But you need to look further. It's not just about the cost either. I know there's a ton of plans out there that just say, we're the lowest cost provider, you should go with us. It's not that you shouldn't be interested or concerned or focused on the costs, but you need to look at all of the variables to see if it works in your particular situation. What works for you might not work for your neighbor. So even though they're telling you, hey, I got this great income tax deduction, I saved a bunch of money on my taxes, this is how I did it, I used this plan, you're like, hey, I want an income tax deduction. Who doesn't? But in this scenario, small things can make those changes. Now let's go through some scenarios where we're not even worrying about the income tax deduction. Because if some states have state income tax and have the deduction, but they will reciprocate with other states, meaning no matter what state or what plan you choose, you can get a tax deduction or even a credit, which I didn't even go over in this video. But there are benefits to doing that. Or with states like the state of Florida, which doesn't have a state income tax. So from that perspective, it wouldn't matter which state that you go to as far as taxes. So if I just get rid of this state tax and the max deduction, we'll put them both at 0. We'll put this back to 8%. And then you can see that plan 2 is going to make more sense if the portfolios are the same, meaning we're getting the same rate of return on our investment. The lowest cost provider, again, makes sense in this particular situation, no matter what we do to the time. It could be in there for 1 year. It could be in there for 18. It could be in there for 200 years. If it's cheaper and they're the same plans or the same investments, it's going to make sense to go with the lowest cost provider. But again, going back to our rates of return, that 9% could have an impact on this plan. Now, I only have it at 1 year. So of course, the one with the higher rate of return is going to make more sense, but let's see it over time. It's 5 years. It's still plan 2, but from a ending balance standpoint, it would be plan 1. And if we put that to 18 years, it's still going to be plan 1, even though plan 2 has the lower cost. So there's no perfect formula that's going to work in all scenarios. You need to look at your particular plan and the plans that you're comparing, because some of them will have different types of fees. So you need to go back and you need to calculate those out. And I know it seems like a ton of work, but if you're trying to compare these plans, this is the only way to do it. You have to look at all the costs and all the variables, compare the plans from an investment standpoint. And that's a lot of times why you'll see the rating systems as a star rating rather than a cost rating or a performance rating. Now they'll rate all those different categories, but it's really difficult, again, to name just one plan that's going to work for everybody. So even if you're looking at rankings, the rankings really don't mean a whole lot. It's just somebody saying, hey, I like this plan under these set of criteria in this particular situation. So it's kind of ridiculous to say that this plan is better than that plan based on cost or even performance. And some plans allow you to put money into the 529 plan, get the tax deduction from your state, and then take that money and put it into a different 529 plan, possibly one with better performance and has lower costs. Now, if you don't know at this point, you can go to any state and use their 529 plans. There's a lot of people that think they can only use their state's 529 plan. And if they hear people saying, well, it's not a great plan, the performance isn't great, the fees are really high, and then they say, okay, well, I'm just not going to save it all. That's not true. You can go to another state and you can do these cost comparisons, or you can do these comparisons, look at the rates of return and all these different variables to figure out which plan you should use. Now, I haven't seen a calculator that's comparing the cost in this way, but if you've seen one, let me know in the comments down below. And I'll publish this on our blog. As soon as I can figure out how to publish it on our blog, I'll put it up there. But in the meantime, if you're considering different 529 plans, let me know in the comments down below, and I'll do cost comparisons and analyses on future videos for your 529 plans. Just let me know in the comments down below. And if you've enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and leave your comments down at the bottom.